There was a very influential data sheet on low-pass filters put out by the GQRP Club. It was written by the late Reverend George Dobbs, G3RJV. Filters like that were built in their hundreds, if not thousands, in homebrew QRP designs. I built one for 10 MHz or the 30 metre band. I'll put mine on an Antrino so you can see what its response curve looks like. Then I'll add one capacitor to change its properties, particularly if you want the filter to be useful on both 7 and 10 MHz. Here's the filter circuit. There are 7 elements, 4 capacitors and 3 inductors, though I've doubled up on the capacitors because 2 are the same value. So I'm using 6 270 picofarad capacitors in this filter. If you wanted to split hairs, the values in the GQRP Club datasheet are slightly different. They use 560 picofarad instead of my 2 lots of 270. But it's only 20 picofarad difference, and the difference should be very little in practice. Here's the circuit of the filter I built. It uses T68-2 toroids. These are red in colour and quite large, so there's no difficulty in being able to fit the turns on them. This is the filter in a box. It's actually got some other bits and pieces in it. You should ignore the black toroid, that's something else, but the toroids in the filter are this one, and this one. I've now connected the low-pass filter to the Antrino. For more on the Antrino, see my previous review. I've put in a centre frequency of 15 MHz and a span of 30 MHz. It is set to SNA mode. Here's the response curve, what you'd expect from a low-pass filter. If we move the arrow, you can see that the response starts to drop off just below 12 MHz. And it's fairly constant below 12 MHz. You can just see the frequency on the top right. Hence, it offers negligible attenuation in the 30 metre band, which is what it was designed for. It's reading minus 18 dBm, so we'll go up in frequency at the second harmonic, just above 20 MHz. It is minus 63, so difference between minus 18 and minus 63 is 45 dB down. Now, what if we wanted to use this filter on a 7 MHz transmitter? Well, the main issue is that the second harmonic at 14 MHz is not that well attenuated. If we go back here, it's minus 18, and at 14 MHz it is minus 35, so the drop-off has only just begun and it's only minus 17 dB down. 17 dB down is not acceptable, and a long way from the 45 dB down that we mentioned before when we were using 10 MHz. There's several ways around that. The most common would be to put in another filter for 7 MHz. Its cutoff might start at 8 MHz and you'd have a similar attenuation to this filter on 10 megahertz. So you would be able to get your minus 45 dB down quite easily. The problem with that is that you're going to have to switch the filter, and switching RF is not as easy as just putting in a transistor or IC switch. You may have to use relays and extra switching circuitry, or even diodes, and all those have extra complications. So ideally, if we were building a 7 and 10 megahertz transmitter, that would be an ideal small dual band DX machine that would allow operation on two popular bands. Then it would be worth thinking of an alternative. An alternative that only requires one filter in line, so then there's no switching. Fortunately, there is a way out of this. If we can put in a notch at around 14 megahertz by adding another tuned circuit, then we'd be able to get good attenuation at 14 megahertz, which is the harmonic of 7 megahertz. We'd keep good attenuation at 20 megahertz, which is the harmonic of 10 megahertz, and also all frequencies above. So that would enable a simple filter suitable for both 7 and 10 megahertz without any switching. Fortunately, there are other filter designs that do just that. Or you could just modify this GQRP Club filter. You just need to add one part between A and B. That forms a paralleled tuned circuit, and a parallel tuned circuit is high impedance, which means that it effectively blocks signals at a particular frequency. If we set that particular frequency to the frequency where this filter had very poor attenuation, i.e. 14 megahertz, and that was because its cutoff was around 11 megahertz, then we should be able to get a better response curve. With an online LC resonance calculator, I plugged in 100 picofarad, and in conjunction with 1.25 microhenry, the resonant frequency is 14.235 megahertz, i.e. exactly where we want the notch. The 100 picofarad has now been soldered across the center inductor. That causes the circuit to look like this. Now the curve looks like this. There's now a steeper drop-off immediately after the 11 megahertz elbow. We're at minus 21 dB at 10 megahertz. If we go up to 20 megahertz, like we did before, then it's minus 74 or minus 73, so it's over 50 dB down. More importantly, for this test, if we compare 7 megahertz, it is minus 17 dB versus 14 megahertz, minus 61 dB, then there's a much larger drop-off of more than 40 dB. Now, you might want to change some of the values so that the 10 megahertz attenuation is a dB or two less like we had before. But overall, as you can see, it's a much better low-pass filter circuit. And it's the sort of thing you'd do if you wanted a filter suitable for both 7 and 10 megahertz. If you wanted to cover another pair of bands, then you would approximately double the values if you wanted both 3.5 and 5 megahertz, or you'd use somewhat smaller values if you wanted 14 and 21, or 21 and 28. And VHFers might even think about adapting this design for 50 and 70 megahertz if you're in European countries that allow 70 megahertz. You should be able to get quite a good roll-off on both those bands with a circuit like this. So, thought this video was interesting. It shows that just adding an extra capacitor can change the filter bandpass characteristics for the better, and can definitely make construction simpler if you're building a dual band transceiver for two adjacent bands, like 7 and 10 megahertz.